The night was cold, much like his heart had been for years. In a towering penthouse above the city, a man who had built his empire on ruthless decisions sat in silence, his sharp gaze fixed on the storm outside. He had everything: wealth, power, control. Yet beneath the polished surface, loneliness clawed at him, though he'd never admit it. That was until she entered his life. His injuries had forced him into an unfamiliar position, vulnerable, reliant on a caregiver he neither wanted nor trusted. She was quiet but efficient, never overstepping, never prying. There was something about her, something familiar that he couldn't quite grasp. And despite his icy demeanor, she never flinched. If anything, she seemed to understand him in a way no one else had. But then one night, he overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear. A single sentence unraveled everything he thought he knew. His caregiver wasn't who she claimed to be. And the moment he discovered her true identity, his world, his carefully built fortress of control, came crashing down. Who was she? And why had she come into his life now, of all times? The answers would change everything. The air in the penthouse felt different now, heavier with unspoken truths. He sat motionless in the dimly lit study, the flickering city lights casting long shadows across the walls. His mind raced, replaying the words he had just overheard, each syllable unraveling the carefully woven reality he had clung to. His caregiver, so quiet, so composed, had been hiding something. And not just anything. Something big. Something that had to do with him. His grip tightened around the glass in his hand, the ice clinking against the sides as the liquid swirled. He wasn't a man easily caught off guard. In business, he was always 10 steps ahead, calculating, untouchable. But this was different. This was personal. She entered the room just as he was about to speak, her eyes meeting his with that same calm expression she always wore. But now, he saw past it. He saw the careful restraint, the way she held herself too still, as if bracing for impact. "You knew," he said, his voice cold, controlled. "You knew me before this." For a split second, something flickered across her face. Regret? Pain? It was gone too quickly to tell. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied smoothly, but he could hear the slight unsteadiness in her tone. He leaned forward, placing the glass on the table with deliberate precision. "Don't lie to me." Silence stretched between them, tense and unyielding. Then, finally, she exhaled, her shoulders sinking just the slightest bit. "I didn't want you to find out this way." That was all she said. No apology. No denial. Just that simple, damning confession. A part of him wanted to demand answers, to force the truth out of her. But another part, the part that had grown to trust her, to rely on her, hesitated. And that hesitation infuriated him. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice lower this time, edged with something dangerous. She looked down for a moment as if gathering the strength to speak. When she finally lifted her gaze, there was something haunting in her eyes. "The question isn't who I am," she murmured. "It's who I was to you." The words sent a chill down his spine. Memories stirred, distant and blurred, like shadows shifting just out of reach. He had spent years burying the past, locking away anything that could weaken him. And yet, here she was, forcing it all back into the light. "You're saying I knew you?" His voice was quieter now, but no less sharp. She nodded. A long time ago. The admission only fueled his frustration. If she had been part of his past, why hadn't he recognized her? Why had she stayed silent? And more importantly, what was her motive now? "I don't have time for riddles," he said sharply. "Tell me the truth. All of it." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the hem of her sleeve. "If I do, everything will change." His jaw clenched. "It already has." Another beat of silence passed before she finally spoke. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she admitted. "Not like this. But when I found out what happened to you, I couldn't stay away." His breath slowed. "Found out what happened to me?" Her expression softened, and for the first time, he saw something else behind her guarded exterior guilt. You don't remember, do you? She asked quietly. His chest tightened. He hated this feeling. This powerlessness. He was used to controlling every aspect of his life, but now it felt like he had been living in a carefully constructed illusion, one that was cracking at the seams. There's nothing to remember, he said stiffly. She shook her head, a sad smile ghosting her lips. That's what you think. The words burrowed into his mind, planting seeds of doubt where there had been certainty. For years, he had kept his past buried under layers of success and calculated detachment. But now, standing in front of him, was someone who had the power to rip it all open again. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he wanted to stop her. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him needed to know, even if it destroyed him. A heavy silence filled the room, stretching between them like a chasm neither was willing to cross. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, stirring something deep inside that he had long tried to forget. The past. The very thing he had spent years running from, burying beneath ruthless ambition and carefully constructed walls. But now, here she was, this woman, this stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all, pulling at the frayed edges of memories he wasn't even sure were his anymore. I need you to leave, he said at last, his voice controlled but tight. She flinched, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, stepping back as if she had expected this all along. I understand. But did she? Did she really understand what it meant to have your entire sense of reality shaken in an instant? To look at someone and feel something familiar, something real, but have no idea why? Before he could stop himself, his voice cut through the tension again. If I don't remember you, then tell me. Tell me why you're here. She hesitated, searching his face for something, perhaps permission, or maybe just the courage to speak. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, because I loved you once. The words hit him like a gut punch. Loved. Past tense. His pulse thundered in his ears as the weight of her confession settled over him. This wasn't just some forgotten acquaintance from his past. She had been something more, someone important. His chest tightened. And now? She gave a sad smile, but there was something unreadable in her eyes. And now, I don't know if you'd want me to. There was something haunting about the way she said it, as if she had already resigned herself to whatever fate awaited them. He hated that. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside had quieted, but inside, everything still felt like it was spinning out of control. He wanted to demand answers, to force the missing pieces of his past back into place, but a part of him, the part that had always feared vulnerability, hesitated. She had known him before he became the man he was today. The man people feared. The man who made decisions without second-guessing. What had he been to her back then? Who had he been? The thought terrified him more than he wanted to admit. Finally, he exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. Tell me everything. She looked at him for a long time, as if trying to decide whether he truly meant it. Then she took a step closer, her voice softer this time. You weren't always like this. He almost scoffed, but something about the way she said it stopped him. You were kind, she continued, her gaze never leaving his. You were guarded, yes, but not like this. Not untouchable. A bitter chuckle escaped him before he could stop it. You think I'm untouchable? She held his gaze. I think you try to be. His jaw tightened. That's the only way to survive in this world. No, she said, shaking her head. That's the only way to be alone in it. The words cut deeper than he expected. She continued, her voice softer now, more hesitant. We knew each other when we were younger. Before everything. Before the company, before the power, before the walls. A memory flickered at the edge of his mind, a laugh, a fleeting touch, the warmth of something long forgotten. But it was still too far, too out of reach. You left, he said suddenly, though he wasn't sure if he was remembering or just assuming. Didn't you? She nodded. I had no choice. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He hated how much that answer affected him. how much it made him feel like a lost boy searching for something he couldn't name. "And now?" he asked. She hesitated. "Now, I'm here. But I don't know if that changes anything." It should have been simple. He should have been angry, should have pushed her away, should have gone back to the life he had built without her. But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what he wanted. He thought about the nights she had stayed by his side, caring for him when he was at his weakest. He thought about the way she had never once backed down from him, how she had seen him not the CEO, not the untouchable businessman, but the man underneath. He had spent so long running from his past, but now it was standing right in front of him, waiting for him to decide. The question was he brave enough to face it? The answer came in the form of a single step forward. And then another. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched him as he closed the distance between them. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel like a man drowning in his own isolation. He felt like someone who had finally found a piece of himself he hadn't even realized was missing. And maybe, just maybe,